Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com Roundtable, brought to you by Techstrong. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning, and we do have an exciting panel ahead for you. First, we do have just a couple of housekeeping notes to cover. So today's session is being recorded. If you miss any of our discussion, or you'd like to maybe rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live session today. If you have any questions, and we really hope you do, we want you to send those in to us using the Q&A tab, which can be found on the right side of your screen. That's also where you'll find the chat tab, and that's where we want you to get to know your fellow audience members. Let us know your thoughts throughout today's program, or maybe just from where you are tuning in. If you navigate to the handouts tab, which should be the furthest tab on the right, you'll find a couple of resources that have been added there by one of our speakers in order to help along with today's topic. And of course, before we are closing out, we will give away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around. So on to the topic today, we'll be discussing observability, monitoring, and analytics. And I'm joined today by Ian Smith, Field CTO at Chronosphere, Will Dirksen, Senior Product Advocate at Everbridge, Brian Binsky, CRE at Fairwinds, Danny Guzman Burgos, Technical Lead at Percona, and leading our discussion today, we have our very own Sharon Florentine. She is the Managing Editor here at Techstrong Group. So to our entire panel, thank you all so much for joining us today. Sharon, I'm going to let you take it away from here.
Cool. Thank you so much, Cody. It is great to be here today with all of you, and I'm super excited. I get to hang out today with Ian, Will, Brian, and Danny, and we are going to talk about observability, monitoring, and analytics. So I think we've got a lot to cover today, so I'm just going to say this one thing, and then we will jump right in. Please, folks, I see a lot of you saying hello and jumping in already. So let's keep that going and throw your questions in the chat. We will try to incorporate those into the discussion as they come in. So cool. With that, I'm going to start off with a hard one. What exactly do we mean when we say observability? What does it mean? So does anybody want to be the guinea pig and go first? Will, I'm going to throw it to you because you're right there next to me.
Sure. Yeah. Am I coming through loud and clear?
You are. I can hear you just fine.
Beautiful. Yeah, no. I mean, observability really is, the ability to measure internal states of our systems, of our services, just kind of looking at it from, the amount of the information that's coming in from sensory data. So, yeah.
Okay. Seems pretty straightforward. Anybody else want to chime in before I dig a little deeper on that?
No? I would like to add that observability it's also a package, right? So it's something that encapsulates all these tools and procedures that we have on looking at systems or systems that are related and correlated and found correlation between all these moving parts. So it's a package also.
Okay. Awesome. So does it mean different things to different people in different roles?
Yeah, I definitely think it does. There's a lot of aspects of observability that overlap with monitoring, and maybe that's something we can dig into a little bit later. But from an individual engineer's perspective, maybe it's just the ability to handle on-call, right? Like, hey, I have an incident, I get alerted, I need the ability to figure out what's going on. From an SRE organization's perspective, as Danny said, maybe it's the tooling, maybe it's the best practices that go along for enabling a whole organization. For a business, maybe it's just the ability to understand and operate their software alongside the infrastructure and the orchestration. Maybe it's the ability to just have that confidence that we know what's going on. And it starts blurring that line into, well, do we know what's going on with our business? Do we know what's going on with our customers? So to me, observability is the ability to answer questions about what's happening with a complex system, and being able to do that, particularly in today's more modern environments, where it's less about have a big monolith and just logging and that's all I need, but particularly where I have complexity and I have depth and I have a lot of people as well, because I think oftentimes that people element sometimes gets ignored a little bit. Observability tends to be about how do organizations and how do people and personas interact with those systems and keep them operational.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Brian, you want to add? Uh-oh. I'm not able to hear Brian. Anyone else?
Can't hear Brian either.
Nope.
No.
Sorry, Brian. Oh, he's coming back.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Take it away.
Okay, sorry about that. But
Okay.
yeah, just to add on to that, from a perspective of trying to create and implement a system, it was with the sense of having a complex system, but trying to answer a fundamental question around how do we understand what's happening with a request from end to end, and how do we build all that up with everything that everyone else here has said, but kind of starting from that fundamental question and trying to build a system around that.
So
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
We talked about, different roles need to see different things. The observability for one doesn't necessarily match, the observability for another. So just let me throw that in there too.
Yeah, definitely. So then, yes, as Ian said, let's dig a little deeper. How does that differ from monitoring?
So the same way that DevOps came and make this bridge and fill this gap between operations and developers, the whole observability, it's a mean to fill that gap as well. Monitoring is more something more common for operation people, where they'll try to figure it out that resources are up, things are working okay. But for developers, it's more important like the context and how things are behaving, right? Not only that it's up or down. So this is the answer for that bridge that DevOps created in form of a tool. So many of you say, I think it was Brian, like how the a request it's working, right? I come from the database world, and sometimes that means nothing on the database world. Sometimes it's just like, okay, so I have this request and it's taking forever for the database to replace something. What's going on in there? So observability adds this context to the monitor and say, okay, this is not working because there's some sort of latency or whatever that the program, the app, it's looking at it, but the app doesn't know what's going on inside. So here's where it complements. So monitoring came in and say, okay, let's see if it's something inherit of the query, the request, or it's something else with the resources. Something's adding latency, something's adding high concurrency or logs or whatever. So it's this. It's where these both worlds meet, right? Operations and developers, and it helps to give context to monitoring and to help debugging and finding answers.
So it's about showing you why something is happening in a broader sense, rather than just, yep, it's broke, gotta fix it. This is why.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I know Ian is really excited to talk about this question, so I'm going to throw this one to you. And sometimes, on DevOps.com, we get a lot of stuff observability focused, and it seems that to me that people are struggling a little bit through these like 5 stages of, in my head, I call it the observability grief, where it's like, denial that you have to go beyond the monitoring and the analytics, to then like anger and finally you get to acceptance, where it's like, all right, fine, I guess I need this tool. What are these challenges that folks are struggling with? Like, why do they not want to go here? Where are we with understanding the need for this and accepting it and then implementing it?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of different ways you can look at it. I think in particular for today's problems, one of the big issues is, and we touched a little bit on this in terms of complexity, is growth, right? If you have complexity, you have to have a lot of data. This is not a new problem, but oftentimes it's thought of purely from a technical facet. How many solutions, whether they be open source or vendor, they talk about, the big numbers, right? They talk about, billions of X or how many petabytes and all these kinds of things. And having spent a lot of time in the observability industry, working for a lot of vendors, I think they've sort of lost some of the point of this, right? Like the technical is there to serve organizational outcomes, whether they can be organizational outcomes for the individual, they can be organizational outcomes for the whole business. But by fixating purely on just like, hey, what could we do with this data from a purely technical perspective, rather than what do people actually need to do with this? You're talking about some of the things that Danny said about providing that context and answering the questions, as opposed to, well, how many distributed traces are going to go shove through a pipeline all at once? So the data growth problem, I think, presents itself in a bunch of different ways. And there's aspects, particularly with the rise of SaaS solutions, where cost has become this sort of like crazy thing where it just becomes accepted that, hey, I'm going to deploy into AWS or GCP, and my business is going to increase maybe 100% over the next year, but my AWS bill might go up 150%, and my observability bill might go up 300%. And they're just sort of taken for granted and accepted. Oh, you're just generating this much data. You have to pay for all of this data. But is all the data useful? It's sort of like this fundamental question that in my career, a lot of customers have asked me. It's like, hey, how do I know who's using what? Can I manage this? And if you think about it, the observability vendors are a little bit apart. Like, it's not in their best interest to do these kinds of things, because their bills can keep skyrocketing, their valuations can keep going up. But the data growth can also present lots of other issues as well if you don't manage it, right? You can have performance issues, you can have scale and reliability issues, and all those kinds of things. But ultimately, if you're not solving for organizational pain, engineering teams start getting bigger and bigger and bigger, unless you're constantly joining a new startup, or you're a small sustainable team. And oftentimes, maybe you are in a small sustainable team, but you're part of a much larger organization. How do you coordinate across lots and lots of different people? It's very different. Let's take a basic fundamental building block of even monitoring, dashboards. It's very different when you have 5 people using and managing dashboards than if you have 50,000.
Right.
But do the products actually do anything differently between those two audiences? Probably not. So I think there are lots of problems. I definitely love to hear from the rest of the panel, but I think those are some of the key things that I think about is the solutions don't solve for organizational pain, and they don't solve for the data growth. It's very common in cloud and cloud native environments.
I would like to add something what Ian mentioned, and it's around cost, right? It's funny because observability might add some costs, but it's also monitoring itself. And in all these cloud environments with cloud vendors and the whole new team of financial operations or FinOps that are monitoring unit economics, right? And they're using the same tools that one might use for monitoring resource usage, database, servers, whatever, to monitor the unit economics, right? And keep it under control. So it's another part of the whole observability concept, which is pretty cool. Like putting on the same package, things are related with the app, things are related with the operation, and things are related with finance. I think that's really nice.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, you kind of mentioned the cost that's associated with it, but on the flip side, what is the cost of an outage? What's that going to cost your organization? Minutes, seconds, that really adds up more so than the cost of having a, observability platform and a good way to respond to those incidents as they, come up. So.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I mean, when we're, to what Ian said about trying to balance that all out, how do you, if we're setting up an observability system with monitoring components? How do we understand what to ingest? How do we understand what to, set up using tools that companies are charging for by use, but in a way that makes sense, that gives us the information we need, but doesn't bloat the system, as it were. And I think that's a tough thing to do with some of the current tools that are otherwise give us a lot of value, but make it difficult to keep our costs from potentially exponentially scaling out based on the amount of information that we're bringing in.
The last one that I'll highlight there is also that in particularly the containerized worlds, the new horizon of microservices, it's not just the volume of data, but it's the complexity of the environment. And I think there are a lot of solutions who talk about when microservices compatible and all these other things, but are they making things better? In actual fact, I think it's sort of like trying to hold back the dike. You're putting your finger in the wall sort of situation where they may be bringing new capabilities, but if you compare it to where we were with monoliths, instances are taking much longer to resolve, to Will's point about the cost of downtime. So you're spending more, but you're actually sort of like continually sort of taking one step forward and two steps back in sort of those key outcomes, as I was mentioning, for the organization.
Right. And so another question that comes up a lot is cloud native, is that going to force the observability issue? I mean, are we really pushing this to become an absolute necessity just because of the complexity of cloud native apps?
Yeah, I definitely think that if you, for example, are doing your more traditional monitoring things, if I'm just looking at my CPU, I'm just looking at my latency, and you're trying to do that going from, I had 2 applications. Now I have a couple of hundred microservices, and I have all these different workflows and all these different ways that my customers or users might express themselves. I need the ability to get more granular, as everyone's talked about, ask those questions and get more specific. What's happening with a subset of my users? It's no longer, oh, my monolith is offline and I can just reboot it or add some more memory. It's what's happening with my paid users versus my unpaid users. How do I ask those questions? And maybe they're unknown unknowns, like some people refer to observability. But cloud native brings all this additional complexity and all this additional growth and potential. But fundamentally, even something like, where is my problem, right? I think that's probably the biggest issue when you move into microservices and a cloud native environment is, where is my issue? Because I might have something, from Danny's world of a database that is currently causing problems, maybe 50% of queries are failing. How does that propagate up? Oh, well, we have issues in login, we have issues in checkout, we have all of these other things. But how do we understand that? Because maybe there are 100 services all experiencing errors. They're all sending off alerts. How do you, if you're looking at that giant alert storm, how do you make sense of that? How do you know where to go and spend your time and attention? And if you are on the database side of things, and maybe you are having issues across multiple databases, how do you know which one to go and focus on because it's impacting your business in the biggest way? So that additional complexity from cloud native, I think, is definitely going to force a reckoning in the outcomes, but then also on the cost side of things. One of the big changes that I see is a lot of organizations, big engineering organizations, trying to turn away from the SaaS vendor side of things and trying to, I wouldn't say build it themselves, but maybe assemble it themselves with open source. A lot of open source technology out there in the monitoring observability world, and big investments from many large engineering organizations. So I think it's going to drive a lot of change if things don't change and those outcomes aren't actually fully represented.
Yeah, I might add that it's not just this cloud native, it's more on microservices and the easy of these microservice architectures thanks to cloud computing and containers, right? And the easy of the elasticity to scale out or scale up, all the stuff that it can increase the complexity of how these things work together. Because it's not that microservices is just different services independently isolated. No, they still work together. There is some sort of transaction, distributed transactions that might use, for example, on the data layer, the same instance, right? But what it's causing the problem from all the 100 microservices that my data layer, it's given the data, right? It's super complex. So that's why it's important to have several tools to narrow down the issues. Like APM can give you really good visibility on, okay, the highest latency is coming from this particular microservice, and now we need something else. The APM just can only go as far as it's possible of showing, okay, this is the microservice problem. Then you have to complement, right, with monitoring tools that are part of the observability stack, right? Say, okay, this is where the problem it's, this is where the bottleneck is. It is right now. Let's see why it's happening. Then just start to complement all the stuff. It's just a whole ecosystem.
Yeah, as you said before, it's context.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So does it require a completely separate platform then, or can you kind of cobble something together from what you've already got?
I mean, you certainly can. I think you're kind of, at that point, trying to push a square peg in a round hole, so to speak.
Yeah.
Unless you have the maturity within your organization to actually do that efficiently. And, there's just vendors out there that do a better job of it. It's what they do day in, day out. So
to that point then too, what does a good observability solution platform, what would that include? What does that look like?
I would say based on my experience with it, kind of evaluating and setting them up, a good one, at least for the experiences that we had and our needs, were based on having all these components kind of together, easily accessible from one another, that didn't just provide kind of correlations, but provided the sort of granularity with everything to enable you to really pinpoint in on where a problem was happening, how it was affecting the system, and be able to jump around very quickly. So like to Danny's point, there may be an APM component, but I could quickly see from that, okay, the actual issue may actually be a database query that's resulting from this and causing a slowdown, be able to see database performance as part of that, and really just be able to, in a way that both provides the information, but in a very relatively intuitive way. So lots of different people can come in and see things from whatever perspective they're coming from.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point. I spend a lot of my time talking to larger organizations, and you trying to take older solutions or solutions that are trying to morph themselves into cloud native. One of the things that I often talk about is sort of an inverted pyramid. You end up with sort of the focal point being these really experienced engineers at the very bottom of this inverted pyramid, who get all the pressure on them because they know the tools, they know the environment, they know the applications. And as the organization grows, the wedge on top of them grows and grows, but the ability for the tooling to support all of those doesn't. So you end up with sort of a, sometimes, depending on terminology, maybe it's a power user versus sort of the novice or general developer. And it might be okay if you have 50 engineers and you have 5 power users. 1 to 10 ratio might be okay. But you go from, what I tend to see is that as they grow, they go from 50 to 500. It's still just 5 power users. And so that ability for everyone to come in and get value, I think, is something that is sorely missing. And I know that the vendors are trying, but I think the way that they do it is they try to do sort of what I call the roller coaster approach, right? Is if you get on the roller coaster, you go around, first time it's super exciting, and you get off and you go on again, it's the same roller coaster. And it's super approachable because anyone can come up and buy a ticket. But the thing is, you go like, all right, cool, I hit the top of the thing. I want to go left. Nope, it always goes right. And you go on 100 times and the excitement fades, the value fades. But it's very difficult, right? You don't want everyone building their own roller coaster. So I'm not saying it's an easy problem, but I think it's a good analogy to think of like, well, if you have everyone go on, yeah, everyone can go on the roller coaster, but sometimes you need the ability to go and sort of branch off a little bit and build your own so they can be tailored. And I think that's really important, is there's no one size fits all for everyone. Things for large organizations may not work for smaller organizations. And based off your technology choices, it may even be something like, you pick GCP, maybe it's different to a solution you might pick if you're on AWS. And so I guess the point is that the complexity of all of this isn't just at the technical layer. It's how do you evaluate these things? How do you think about your own requirements? You can't just go, hey, my friend over there, another company who just bought XYZ solution, give me your list of requirements, because they're going to be completely different. So how do you ask those questions of yourself internally is something that I think is maybe a little bit atrophied when it comes to this kind of tool selection.
And that's a real concern from a vendor side here, like adoption. Like you can have the best tool out there, but if nobody's willing to use it, or just these 5 power users that Ian mentioned, it's not worth it. It's not worth it to deploy or to buy it, right? So that's a very critical thing when you're evaluating these tools. Like, what's the learning curve? It's probably too much. Maybe my developers will face metrics fatigue, because there are so many things that it's just noisy. So it's just not only the ability or the features or what it can do, but also how easy it is to use. How fast I can get to the value that it's adding. That's something that the vendors spend quite a amount of time thinking about how to make that thing simpler, right?
Yeah, maybe I ask a question of the group. It's how many times have you seen a customer or a prospect or organization you work with where the power users and the most sophisticated users are the ones doing the tool evaluations? That tends to be the case. I care about observability. I spend all my time thinking about observability. I'm the one who should evaluate it. And then, okay, what happens about the 495 other engineers who aren't experts? And when they come time to use it and you get that adoption, as Danny was talking about.
I think that's a great point. And when I went through a vendor selection exercise, that was actually one of the big criteria for it. It wasn't just the technical side. It was really understanding how do we use this as a tool that could bring teams together and allowed for different types of users, both from just a day-to-day use standpoint, but also from a configuration standpoint. We also, aside from just having 500 people who could use the platform, we didn't want to just make it a system where only 2 people could actually run or build the thing or configure different components to interact with it. And so that to me is important, because it was in fact replacing a tool that was more of a square peg in a round hole, that really was difficult to configure and really not built, like you were saying, some tools for kind of a microservice or cloud native environment. The difference between something that requires a ton of like log-based regex queries to get information from an API versus, oh, this thing just, you run it in the cluster and it starts giving you data. That's a big difference, and means a lot as far as what's going to be valuable for an organization.
And I think it also speaks to, obviously the cost issue and the cost evaluation too, because that's ROI. That's, you spend all this money. If only 5 people can even figure out how to use it, then you may as well, you're throwing your money away.
Yeah, I think ROI is a funny one. A lot of people oftentimes think about just the licensing cost, or even maybe the hardware cost if you're running open source solutions. Mm-hmm. But as Brian's mentioned, there's the cost of setup, right? And it's how far can you spread that burden? If you go and put 100% of the work on 2 people, it's actually drastically different than if you can spread that out. So it's 1% of the work across 100 different people, because it allows you to scale. It allows you to not be bottlenecked and all those kinds of things. And then particularly in the cloud native world is how you're acquiring the data. How do you do instrumentation? Projects like OpenTelemetry are great, but there is a level of flexibility that requires a level of commitment and ownership that can be very difficult to ascertain both what the return is and what the investment is. But one of the changes that I see in the market is that there's definitely an intent to go away from, oh, my vendor controls my data. Instead, I should control my data, and I might put it in 1 or 2 or maybe 3 different vendors, but I control all of that. It's very difficult to quantify the return on that, but it can be very easy to quantify the infrastructure cost and the time investment. Like, oh, is this really worth doing? It's like, well, it's going to mean that you're not locked into proprietary vendor, and you're not restrained by what they can do.
So I'm going to back up a little bit and go a little bit more basic and ask if we can talk about the difference between metrics, logs, and traces, because I think, myself included, that tends to get a little muddled. What do those three terms mean, and how does that tie into observability? Uh-oh, I should have started with this one.
No, yeah.
That's the one that everyone wants to dodge.
Well, okay, sorry.
I think they're
okay. Yeah. Well.
No, they're all different parts of the observability. Of the act of being observable. So I mean, the log files, we're actually looking at those granular timestamp, line items, if you will, that have happened on those services, on those servers. I'll let the other guys kind of talk about it too, but if you want to think of it like observing, analyzing data coming in, trying to go out and find the different pieces of the problem that has occurred, essentially, for me, is kind of how I see it. So
Gotcha.
I think logs are that legacy thing. Everyone who's ever been a developer knows, hey, I think something's happening here. Let me print line out a message saying here, got to this point, or error here. It's very basic, it's very free form, and obviously it tends to be the foundation of a lot of monitoring in a lot of organizations. It's important to also note that logs are not just used for performance, which is usually what we think about for observability. It's also used for security purposes as well. Metrics is, it's just numbers, right? It's how much CPU am I using every minute? How much business have I done? Because that's an example of a business metric. Application metrics could be, what is the latency of my application? It's lots of numbers. The good thing about metrics is that it really allows you to be very dense, right? You might have an application that is doing millions of requests per second, but you can just see the total number and you can see what the latency is. You don't have to go and take a look at the individual log lines for everything like that. I think where things start to get very interesting is traces. And I can't remember who it was mentioning, but they were talking about observability, I think, in the context of looking at requests through a system. And to me, that's what tracing is really good at. Distributed tracing in particular. So in a distributed environment, lots of microservices, understanding when you go to log in on your mobile application, how it goes from one from your mobile application down into the back end, and may touch lots of different things, ultimately things like databases or even external APIs. The Facebook API is always a great example of an external dependency. How do you track that? How do you know what's taking the longest, what's slowing things down? Tracing, I think, is really key to understanding that. And in that complex environment, where is my problem? Those three data types together. And there are others, right? There are events. There's things like I did a deployment. And this is where I think you can't define observability by the data. You have to define it by the outcomes. And in your system, maybe you don't do logs. I know some new engineering organizations who are determined they're not going to generate logs from applications anymore. They're going to try and go out with metrics and traces, but also events as well. So I think it's different types of data for different purposes, and using any of them isn't good or bad. It's what do you get out of it?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So we keep coming back to the data issue. So how do we manage all of this observability data that we're collecting, and how do we manage it? Where do we store it? How long should we store it? I mean, this is the big question, right? Now that you have all this data, what are we going to do with it?
Use it as fast as possible and get rid of it. No, there are nuances and complexity on. Let's talk about storing the data. Like, it's not only about costs on storage, right? Or it's not only the complexity to find what we're looking for. It's also complexity on, for example, on the database world, if you're storing logs. which are the transactions, which it might have information, and you're operating on a country with that has GDPR compliance, and someone says, okay, I want my information to be removed. You have to remove it from the database, but also from the logs, right? So if you get way too much logs in terms of volume, there's complexity added and a cost to figure it out and find out all the places where there's data that you need to remove to fulfill that requirement, right? So it's more of what's the value for the company of storing this data for an X amount of period. Sometimes there are legal things that you need to observe, and states say, okay, you need to store this for 2 years or 3 years, whatever, right? But beside of that, should I have to store it everything? What will be the cost for not only having there, like actually there's still some assets that you need to manage eventually, even for removing, right? Company need to be sure that they're removing the things that can be deleted or purged, right? So you got to be very careful on that. It's all this stuff that needs to be taken care in, or be aware of it. So that's even outside the scope of observability, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if for observability it's more depend on debugging cases or postmortems that you would like to do. That's a different approach. I don't know. You guys have. What do you think about it?
I think you have to right size. Absolutely, you have to be clear internally. Like, what do you want from this? Chuckle a little bit when Danny said, "Oh, use it and throw it away." And there's lots of organizations who definitely do that. I think it is an appropriate thing to do, but then it's a case of, hey, how do we do capacity planning? Because we only had 2 weeks of retention on our data. Well, we can't do capacity planning anymore. So you have to think about those use cases, but you also have to think about the value. If I stored all of my raw data for 13 months, sure, I might be able to do capacity planning, but would that break the bank? would the capacity planning have to become more about the cost of my retention than anything else? So I think understanding what do I need to do with the data? What would I love to be able to do with the data? Build out all those use cases, and then, well, how can I understand what that's going to cost for me? Capacity planning may not need to keep all my data around forever. Could it be a very small subset of my data? Well, what subset of the data is it? And then what could I do to pull out just that subset? And this is what links back to a little something that I said earlier, where I see organizations now picking and choosing which data to put where. They may have one big pipeline of observability data, and they may stream off some to a data lake. It doesn't need to be very fast. It can be very, very cheap. But for capacity planning purposes, you can go, okay, well, I'm going to run this query on Friday, and maybe Tuesday morning I get my answer back about how many servers do we need for next year. That's fine. Versus, okay, I do need to go and find some place where the data for the last day needs to be very fast, super accessible, and a whole bunch of out-of-the-box analysis so that I can deal with those instant type situations. But being able to pick and choose and understand, well, out of my massive data set, what is useful now, what is useful later, what is costing me the most, those are the insights. To Danny's point earlier about you need observability for observability so that you can even understand those cost implications. And again, it's a lot more complexity. And this maybe leads into something that I don't think we've talked about is the rise of a central observability team. It used to be, okay, it was just DevOps tooling and it's just sort of part of it. And then, of course, we had SRE come along. And now I see a lot of, okay, maybe within or attached to the SRE group, there's a dedicated observability team who are focused on these questions, the intersection of the return on investment, the financial ops, the best practices and those kinds of things. And I think that's where you can have that focus, because they're the central point of understanding of, well, what does the business need and what are the implications and what are the capabilities we have to manage this data?
Yeah. So where does security fit in with all of this?
That's definitely the question that security doesn't want you to ask too. So
Yeah.
No, I mean they definitely fit in. Look, if you just look at the data, looking for anomalous activity, looking for anomalies within the stack. I mean, observability from a security standpoint comes, in a multi-layered model, really. So, generally speaking, it does tend to, add a layer of complexity to what it is we're doing, but it's something that should be built into the process. It shouldn't be security coming in. It should be native to the environment. So it shouldn't necessarily be as much of a question, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, that kind of DevSecOps approach to it. But it also seems to me like the more insight and visibility that you have, which is what observability is trying to give you, then the faster you'd be able to identify and then resolve issues, which then results in more secure systems overall.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Sure. I mean, from the user perspective of the observability tools, there are you gotta be sure, and it's a given fact that SecOps teams will be very, very, very taking care of that. If you're following some sort of compliance, PCI compliance, HIPAA compliance, all that stuff, that's still be fulfilled in the observability realms, right? So maybe, or not maybe, some things needs to be adapted, right, for your company. Maybe some data needs to be obfuscated. Maybe some grants needs to be removed for certain kind of people, the stuff, because like you said, and everyone said, this is visibility all over the life cycle and all over the operations. So it might be a risk of some leaks going through the observability tools, right? If you're gonna store logs, you gotta be sure that there are the CISO approves where they're going to be stored and stuff like that. So it's security on all the levels, right? With exactly the same as the databases or how our things are deployed into production. All the stuff needs to be taken care of. So there's a big responsibility from SecOps team, right? When a company is deploying a new observability tool or looking for new options, stuff like that, on usage and visibility levels.
I think real quick, just one thing on the the interactions between security teams and observability functions is oftentimes security can get a lot of value from the observability data set in interesting ways. For example, I know that Netflix, they had a system that tracked a lot of things that you'd consider observability because it was like user behaviors and resource consumption, all these other things. They had a part of the organization that was able to use that data set and essentially find people who were attempting to maybe do some unsavory things with Netflix in terms of pulling content out at a rate that was maybe not for personal use. And so oftentimes that may not fit into something that is generated by security tooling, right? Which is like, hey, am I being attacked and those kinds of things, but it can feed into abnormal behaviors that are they're considered from an organizational perspective to be security issues. In some organizations, I definitely see cases where security wants access to that observability data, and they want to be able to do things that maybe aren't about a stereotypical performance incident, but they want to be able to maybe line that up with some things that they're seeing. It's like, hey, this application is performing strangely. Does it line up with some stuff we're detecting over on the security side? So I think there's at the end of the day, it's a large amount of data being processed and analyzed so you can try and find problems. It's just a different perspective. One's security, one is like performance or incidents. So I do think there's really good opportunity there for cooperation.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that too.
All right. So, do you see a lot of, or I guess any really, it doesn't have to be a lot, observability washing, right? Where maybe vendors or products are trying to capitalize on this term and they're just kind of slapping the label on? Or is it, are you really getting what it says on the tin if you're looking at an observability platform or solution?
Brian, you've had to do some evaluations. I'm curious your opinion.
Sure. I was going to say, I want to hear what Ian says about his opinions. But no, I mean, I think, just when you're looking into it and trying to think through it, just from a kind of high level, it looks like there's some people trying to push like hey, here's tools and now you have observability, rather than starting from kind of the big questions around what you're trying to do and then understanding how the tools are going to come together and solve that. And so I think when we were looking at it, I think while we ended up looking at companies that may have had that idea of just here's the tools, here's what you need. I think coming to it from that other perspective of what questions are we trying to solve, that's really how we got into it and kind of figured out what our solution was going to be. So I think maybe to answer that question a little more clearly from our perspective, I don't know if I would go that far as to say observability washing, but I do think that the tools didn't necessarily come to us saying, hey, we know the question you're trying to solve, here's how we're going to solve it for you.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that despite the initial question you asked, I think that what is the definition of observability is sort of up for grabs. The hardcore truth of it is there's a lot of money in this part of the industry, so marketing is going to try and cater towards like capturing as much attention as possible. And as I think we briefly touched on, there is overlap. To me, observability is a superset of monitoring, right? You don't go into observability going, hey, if I want to know my CPU, I'm just going to like run a query manually every single time. No, you're going to go set up an alert so that if you have too much CPU, you get alerted, right? Alerting is essentially monitoring. But you don't go, oh, I'm only doing observability. It's like, no, I'm trying to do observability because I'm trying to get better, but I'm always going to do monitoring at the heart of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think at least one of the things that is really interesting to me is how can you turn as much observability into monitoring as possible? Because monitoring is a concept that most people get, right? You don't really have to come up with a question. You're like, yeah, I'm of course checking to make sure if I am using too much CPU. So as you run into new problems, how can you try and shorten that pathway? How can you shorten the cognitive burden or reduce the cognitive burden so that it doesn't take a super user who's like, all right, I've got to think about the complex question and then I've got to think about how to implement it in the solution. And then I've got to interpret the data. Can you take these complex scenarios in observability and try and make them sort of like blend on that line of where monitoring and observability is?
Right.
But I guess to answer the question I think that there's a lot of established vendors in the space who are seeing a change coming and are trying to market towards that change. Now, that's fine as long as the product can back it up. And the truth of it is that if the experience, if you're in a monolith, is the same as if you're in a microservices environment and all you do have is just dashboards and pre-built roller coasters, I don't think that is observability, right? So if anyone wants a quote, I don't think you can go up to a roller coaster, slap a sticker that says observability on it and walk away mission accomplished. You have to be able to go from there. Sorry, Danny, go ahead.
No, it's like what happened with cloud native, right? Like it's a concept that is so flexible that marketing teams try to fit whatever into that concept and say, oh, we're cloud native ready, or we're cloud, right? Observability can have the same issue as you just mentioned. Like there are monitoring tools that are just monitoring tool. It's not the full observability. You might have some dashboards, but you don't have the whole picture, right? So it's one of those concepts that it's not hype, but it's very useful to sell. So it can accommodate things are very flexible. So it could it could lead to some misunderstanding, right? So that's why it's very important to do things like this, like let's clarify what is and what is not, right?
Yeah, you need nuance, and I think one of the funniest things when I think about people claiming cloud native, and you're absolutely no judgment if you're using monoliths and VMs and all that kind of stuff. Like, you're not necessarily a bad engineering organization, but just saying, hey, I took my massive VM of 3 monoliths and I shoved it up on AWS. I'm cloud native. Well, that's not true. I think hopefully everyone agrees that's not true. And in the same way, hey, look, I'm a vendor that's been around for XYZ years, and now I just slap some marketing and said I'm observability, and I have metrics, logs, and traces. Like, it's not observability either. But I think it really comes down to the eye of the beholder, right? I think it's difficult, but engineering organizations that value the uptime, value the quality of life of engineers, you need to be able to figure out, like, what does it mean to you? What are the outcomes that you want? And then go from there and try and explore what's out there, whether it's open source or vendor. I really wouldn't recommend anyone try to build their own tooling from scratch anymore. I feel like at least you should be able to start from an open source basis. But yeah, I think you need to define what is it for you and what do you want out of those solutions before you go talk to vendors, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So I think this an audience member asked if there are some key things that you can look for when you're evaluating observability platforms. And I know Brian kind of touched on this earlier when I asked about what you should look for in a solution, but I think this kind of wraps it all up a little bit with what Ian was just saying with the definition. So if you are going to go and evaluate observability platforms, what kind of things should you be looking for? Brian, maybe you want to do
Sure.
a little remix.
Sure. I think how Ian ended his last comment was response was kind of hit the nail on the head there. I mean, it is really specific to what you're looking for. Really think about what are the things that are important to you, how your organization's set up, what are the main things that you need solved, and then go figure out from there what you need to look for in a vendor. Again, before you probably want to start listing out vendors and seeing what their different offerings are. I think someone in the chat mentioned is the way you evaluate specific to your business logic and application and whatnot. I mean, of course it is. You really, if you're using microservices, if you're using containers or Kubernetes, and you're in the cloud, then you definitely need a tool that speaks to that and speaks to the sort of tools that you have in place and has the types of integrations or things that really get you all the data that you could possibly have or need to start making decisions and make things happen. And I think in kind of wrapping up what we talked about earlier around something that's going to make sense for a lot of people too. It's easy to set up, but also allows a lot of different people with different use cases to come together and collaborate, because that, if things like mean time to resolution are important to you, or understanding performance issues and testing or whatever, you need people from different teams to be able to work together and be able to understand the information from their perspectives to get problems solved quickly.
I'll show a little bit of my bias, but I think on top of everything that Brian said, a really important thing when you evaluate observability platform is understand what is the worst case scenario or the best case scenario for your business in terms of, hey, we're a fast growing startup. Our plan is to grow 3x next year. What if we grew 6x? What does that do to our data? And it shouldn't just be, how much is my vendor going to discount? How am I going to manage that stuff? I think is a really important question that we've maybe sort of been smoke and mirrored a little bit, like, oh, no, that's not a valid question to ask. No one has this. Well, I think it's starting to grow when we see vendors coming up to manage log spend and all these other things. And obviously Chronosphere does some stuff in this arena as well. But it should be a question of like, well, how do I manage this? And what does it look like in that best/worst case scenario? Tell me what it's going to be like, because I don't want surprises. Maybe ask those questions of the vendor, like, hey, what are the surprises that other people have had? And really try and understand that, so that it's not just what am I getting today, right? What's the roller coaster on day one, but what is the roller coaster going to be like on day 365 or further on from there?
All right, folks. Well, we're about 5 minutes to the top of the hour, and I know Cody has some great housekeeping wrap-up stuff he needs to get done. So any final thoughts here before I pass the mic back over? Cool. Thank you all so very much for hanging out with me today. Cody, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sharon. And thank you to Ian, Will, Brian, and Danny for joining us as well today. We really appreciate all of you taking the time out of your schedules to join us and share your expertise with us. So thank you so much on behalf of Techstrong.
Thank you.
I'd like, of course.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having us.
So to our audience, just a reminder that today's session was recorded. So following this program, you'll receive an email with a link to access the recording on demand, or you can find the recording living on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars, and just be sure to look in the on-demand section. So at the top of the hour, I did promise we would be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, and our 4 winners are Juan F., Kathy A., Ajay B., and Tina W. So to our 4 winners, congratulations. Please keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card, but if you do not see an email, just check your spam folder. So to our panel, again, thank you once more for joining us, and to our audience, we really appreciate you spending time with us as well. We do ask for just one extra moment of your time to fill out a brief post-webinar survey that should pop up on your screen as soon as we close out, but otherwise, we hope to see everyone at an upcoming Techstrong Learning program. Everyone have a great rest of your day.